Hey everyone, before we get into this episode of The Overlook, I want to tell you about a brand new podcast that's all about Asheville, only each episode is under 5 minutes long. It's a daily radio-styled newscast called Wake Up Asheville. It's a morning podcast updating you on all the important local headlines. We check in with every credible local news source, then boil it all down to what you need to know in under 5 minutes. It's designed to tell you what you need to know and let you get on with your day. There's even a Spanish language version called Despierta Asheville. Wake Up Asheville and Despierta Asheville are both free and available every weekday morning wherever you get your podcasts.
I am a maker, a builder, a baker, although sometimes my messes are all that you'll find. I'll tell a story, both true and allegory. Oh, the process is precious, so it takes up all my time.
Hedy Fischer and Gail McCarthy have been in Asheville since the late 1970s, and along with their artist husbands, played critical roles in the evolution of the River Arts District, from a neglected, polluted wasteland of warehouses into the thriving arts and commerce destination it is today. They also have thoughts on whether the scales of progress in the neighborhood have tipped too far.
It was initially not tourist-driven business at all. It was just artists looking for a place to do their work. The RAD has become, to a large extent, almost solely a tourist destination, and that's not sustainable.
This is The Overlook with Matt Peiken, a podcast about the news, arts, issues, and trends of Asheville, North Carolina. Today is the first in a two-part conversation with Fischer and McCarthy, along with Stephanie Monson Dahl, the city's manager of urban design, place strategies, and long-range planning. Fischer and her husband, Randy Schul, own Pink Dog Artist Studios and Gallery, along with a large gallery and studio on London Road. McCarthy and her husband, Brian, are the founders of Highwater Clays and Odyssey Clayworks. In this episode, we talk about how 2010 marked a key turning point for the River Arts District and how vision and investments from the city and key developers turned the tide. We talk about the differing impacts of hotel and residential development there, managing traffic in the RAD, and how building owners such as McCarthy and Fischer are an aging breed of those continuing their commitment to offering artists affordable workspaces. I didn't even ask a question to start this conversation. I just hit record and we started talking about McCarthy's and Fischer's long histories in Asheville. Fischer is first to speak.
Gail will be our historian because she's been in the River Arts District much longer than I have.
Yeah. Well, no, I don't know, because I've read that you got there also in the late 70s.
I got to Asheville in the 70s, but not to the River Arts District. I didn't buy the property that has now become Pink Dog until 2010.
Which was a pretty key year in the River Arts District, by the way.
How so, Steph?
So in 2010, first of all, for the city, it was when the Riverfront Commission started meeting. So the city was 100% bought in to working with partners down in the River Arts District to make something happen according to the Wilma Dykeman Plan and other plans. It is when, I believe this is also when 372 Depot, which was Mountain Housing Opportunities, it is when that project first opened. I think there's over 60 residential units in there, and they're all affordable housing units, plus a whole bunch of new commercial on the ground floor. It was a mini catalyst for the area, really showing that people believed in making it the place that the artists wanted to see. I mean, affordable housing was a big deal for artists back then as well.
Was that the first housing development in the RAD at that time?
The first actual investment that I remember, I'm trying to remember their name. Ray
Quaid.
Ray Quaid.
Ray and Janet.
Yes. And they actually are on the opposite corner right there on Depot Street.
They're on Depot and Bartlett on the corner.
Yep. And so they purchased that building and had a vision that it could be adaptively reused. And that was the first time that I remember someone, not an artist is what I'm saying, going in and buying up property and saying, I want to be here. I want to provide spaces for other people.
What was the mindset back then in the city and elsewhere? Was it, wow, this is a fantastic vision. We would love to have residents in the River Arts District?
No. At the time, I think the city was just listening to, and this is where Hedy came in. There was a group of people that had invested a lot on Depot Street. This is where a lot of things started off, although we were working on some brownfields things as well, and said, we're trying to make it down here, and it's unsafe. It's not clean. People can't walk around. No one knows how to get here. We have all of these problems. And so the private sector was already doing what they needed to do to make it a vital area. And they were already coming together and meeting, obviously. And there's been this studio stroll effort since the mid-90s. We had lots of not-for-profits in the area. RAD had already been started. But this is when the Business Association really kicked into play and people started thinking about what different infrastructure investments and other programmatic investments needed to be from the public sector in order to make things work. So we were looking at everything from the zoning, how people could have signs and redoing sign packages, making sure that bicyclists had a safe place to be. Parking was one of the number one issues in the area.
Still is.
Yeah, it still is, and it always will be.
Yeah.
But the Wilma-Dyckman Riverway Plan wasn't the only riverfront plan. There'd been plans put together in the riverfront for many years, but it was adopted by the city and the county in 2004. We started working with about $1 million of EPA brownfield grant monies to just get an idea of what was happening in the area from a contamination perspective in 2008. Then by 2010, we were kicking off the design and planning for all the infrastructure investments that eventually became the RAD tip.
Was it something back then, it was just, and maybe Gail, if you can speak to this, was it just piecemeal artists finding spaces in buildings at the time? Oh, I found this open room for $150 a month, and this is great. And then artist friends that person knew would start renting there. Up to that point, was there no concerted effort to create artist studio buildings?
I would say so. In my mind, it was a case of build it and they will come. We obviously started looking for a space for High Water Clays, our business, and we had been growing out of that business, and there was a sign on the Klingman Avenue property for sale, and went to check it. It is sale or lease. I think the movie people had used it for costume storage for a while, seasonally, when they were doing Last of the Mohegans. And I went and saw it and went back to Brian and said, Brian, you have to come. The building said something to me. You have to go and see if it says something to you. We were on Riverside Drive, 600 Riverside Drive, around the corner from where we ended up. We needed extra storage. And Brian came back and he said, that's not our storage. That's our store. And that's the school we've always talked about. So the store moved over. We started Odyssey Center for the Ceramic Arts.
And at the time, correct me if I'm wrong in this, again, I was just alluding to this as a supposition. I imagine that there wasn't a concerted effort to, I'm going to buy the cotton mill and turn this into X number of studios. Even when you bought Pink Dog in 2010, I'm wondering if 20 years prior to that, nobody was buying up buildings to turn into artist studios, right?
Not necessarily. There were 3 large buildings down there that had artist studios in them, 2 of which burned down. The cotton mill burned down, and the current cotton mill is the remnants of that huge building that was there. And the Chesterfield Mill burned down.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And there were artists in both of those buildings at the time. There was also an artist in the Wedge, and that was owned by an investor here, local investor, who eventually sold it to one of the artists, a guy named John Payne, who made articulating dinosaurs that he would sell or lease to natural history museums and that sort of thing. Hedy Torno, she was an artist. She bought her building, the Curve.
Curve, yeah.
John Payne eventually was able to buy the Wedge. The McCarthys had bought their building on Klingman.
Helene and her sister, Trudy,
sister owned
Riverview Station.
So there were already buildings happening when we bought the building that we turned into Pink Dog in 2010. We bought it for Randy to have a studio. I mean, every commercial building we own, we bought for Randy to have a studio.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
And the ones we didn't buy, we wanted to buy for him to have a studio. Yeah. So he's needed bigger spaces and bigger spaces. And that one was so big, we knew that we would rent space to other artists for sure. And as soon as we started painting the outside of the building, people started stopping and saying, what's going on here? But when we bought Pink Dog in the early winter of 2010, they hadn't even broken ground yet on 372 Depot.
Really?
Because
Okay.
I went to the groundbreaking and
I went to the groundbreaking too. I thought that was in 2010.
It was 2010, but it was later in the year.
Okay, yeah.
So at that point, Depot Street, other than Ray Quate's building on the corner of Depot and Bartlett, it was pretty empty and deserted, and it was scary, and you didn't go down there at night
And
and
people were afraid to even
drive through there.
Really?
lock their car doors if they
Yeah.
had to go through.
Yeah. This was a frightening place. People would say to us when we started having studios there, is it safe to come down here?
Did you? I never felt afraid or.
I never did,
Yeah.
but
When people don't see activity and there's boarded up windows
Yeah.
and all that, it's just the perception. But there was a reality as well for when the city purchased, it was before 2010, I think. No, it was right after that. When we purchased the old ice house, there was certainly a lot of illegal activity going on there. People were injured. One person died there last year before the city bought it. And I know when we talked to Patty Cherno about what it used to be like in the area for her to go running, right? When she would run around before New Belgium was,
she was so brave to move down there.
Yeah, it was
by
just
herself
the
in that era.
I don't want to paint it as a completely unsafe area, but the truth was that there weren't a lot of people paying attention, and it felt like only the people that were either invested there and who were these artists that were staying there were trying to make sure that there was any activity happening in the area.
Stephanie, it's interesting because that's not all that long ago. We're talking 15 years ago when this was still an artist piecemeal finding places to be. There weren't developers coming in there, and you're looking like you're searching your memory, Stephanie, to say maybe there were.
But there really weren't. There weren't developers coming in there, and there were local interested people. We did see some investment by local folks. You brought up the Wedge building. There was a moment in time where about 12 people got together and purchased the Wedge building off of John Payne's then widow. And you saw different activities like that.
From your vantage point within the city, was the city worried about, hey, there are a lot of people coming down there. It's not safe. We don't have infrastructure in there. We need to help manage what's starting to mushroom there? Or did the city not recognize what was on the horizon, or in terms of making it a livable, habitable, tourist-friendly area?
The city, or at least myself and our team, we knew exactly what the area could be. And we were helped by a lot of people that were already down there. When we started working there, there were already over 100 artists in the district. So it was very much a thriving arts district, albeit that people couldn't get around and they were confused. And perhaps it was too gritty for some, all of that. But the number one issue when we started working was that there was this stretch of maybe almost a mile along Riverside Drive where there were these huge properties that hadn't seen any kind of investment mostly in 40 years. And the number one reason was that people believed that they were contaminated, that these were old industrial...
Like Superfund sites.
Yeah, and they certainly were not. So the first thing that the city set out to do was to get this grant money and to perform these environmental assessments on about 10 properties in the area, including the property that eventually became where New Belgium is today, New Belgium Brewing is, and some city-owned properties to say, what actually are on these sites? What are the problems with these sites? And we talked with all of the owners, the historic owners and the utilities to just say, what would it take for you to free these up for other people to come in and start thinking about doing something here that would help bring in more feet on the street, more eyes. Mentioned New Belgium, that came out of that. That wasn't a huge thing, but the city's number one concern was just to try to take things incrementally, step by step over time. And the focus was to fix the way that people got around in the district and make that safe.
Again, I wasn't around then. What's changed other than having Riverside looks much different? You've got the roundabout there, but it doesn't look like there's a lot of new roads that were put in there. What's different?
So Riverside Drive is actually completely different. So it used to be that the road that's called River Arts Place that goes in front of Curve and Black Wall Street, that was Riverside Drive. So we rerouted Riverside Drive and created that kind of interior little village node. And that way we were able to use the roundabouts to facilitate traffic movement, get people a little bit pulled away from, at least on that side of the railroad tracks, away from the railroad tracks and try to stop some of the pileups that are happening there. And then there was this dog leg you had to make if you're coming from the north, and Curve would be on the left, and you would have to take a right there while all this other traffic was zooming by in order to get down to Riverview Station or the park system. So there's actually a very different roadway and a different network. When we first started working down there, that side of the river, there were 0 sidewalks, there was no pedestrian lighting, there was no public parking, there was no stormwater system. There were many more buildings that were in the floodway, and the roads were really hard to get around on. There was also no wayfinding.
More after this. When you go to an Asheville City Soccer Club game, you'll see some of the best emerging talent from all over North Carolina, but also you'll see players from around the world trying to better their games and work their way up the professional soccer circuit.
Having players from different countries, from different areas, it brings different kind of styles of play into the mix.
Brooke Bingham is the coach of the women's team.
Soccer is a very creative sport, so I want to encourage them to play in their style. The aspiration for the players comes from within themselves. They kind of dictate that, and we kind of help them and we push them into the direction they want to go.
Homegrown athletes like Laura Greb say playing with and against players with rich soccer traditions elevates her game.
You have players who grew up in Central or South America, and they're more poised on the ball sometimes. They great first touches, excellent vision.
To see soccer with international flair, dial into the Asheville City Soccer Club men's and women's teams. Home games are at Greenwood Field on the UNC Asheville campus. For details, visit AshevilleCitySC.com.
You mentioned the floodway. That's one of the things I was going to ask you about, all of you. Were you concerned? Because flooding happens annually or almost every other year. There's some level of flooding that happens. Were you concerned about rooting your studios in a place that's prone? There were fires, floods. Did that worry you?
For Pink Dog, no. We're far enough from the river that we're really not in the flood plain. And the water would also have to go over the berm that's the railroad tracks in order to get to Depot Street. So we weren't concerned about flooding.
We were always aware of the possibility of flooding. There's even a mark on the exterior of the Riverlink building as to how high the water had gotten in a particular year. And it has come up. It never really hit our building or endangered the building on Klingman Avenue. There was flooding in our first home, which was down in Biltmore Village. There was flooding that went on in our second home, but nothing that was ever disastrous as far as we were concerned.
Both of you, Gail and Hedy, you talked about how your initial impetus was finding homes for Brian's clay business and for Randy's art.
Mm-hmm.
You both founded destination centers for artists, in a sense, with Pink Dog, among other buildings. Odyssey Clay Center has seen scores and scores of ceramic artists come through there. Was there a time when you were operating below the larger public's consciousness where it wasn't tourist-driven?
It was initially not tourist-driven business at all. It was just artists looking for a place to do their work.
When did the pressures of the marketplace start to come into play?
I would say that the start of the studio stroll started an awareness of the possibilities of being able to not only have a studio space, but also sell out of your studio space.
Everybody, I would imagine, at the time would think, studio stroll, great idea, right? We're going to bring more awareness to the work we do, more awareness to this area, which needs support, which needs local resident support, and tourist money wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing. The River Arts District Artists Association developed, right? Or did that already exist?
No, that kind of happened bit by bit, and people getting together and saying, oh, let's have a studio stroll. And then, oh, okay, yeah, you're in the neighborhood now. Let's have a studio stroll.
When did it start to be where our affordable housing issue and crisis started to reach an area of the RAD where affordable workspace, affordable arts working space started to become an issue? When did real estate pressures start rubbing up against the, hey, I found this cheap space? When did that start to be a collision?
I would say that the two of us here right now, it never became something that was an issue for us because our intention was not to make it market-driven. Our intention was always to provide a space in a home for artists and craftspeople. Now, of course, as the years go by and as taxes rise and utilities rise, there have to be some rent adjustments, but we've never paid attention to what the market value of the studio spaces should be.
And interestingly, I have no idea what other studios rent for in the RAD. I've never asked Brian and Gail. I've never asked Patty, what do you rent your studios for?
Really?
Oh, I have no idea. I don't know if I'm high, if I'm low. The only way I know that is if one of the artists who's, been looking around for studio space might mention something. But generally, they don't either. They're just looking for space that they can afford.
Have you found that your artists now, because affordable space becomes so scarce, they're holding on, they stay for many years?
Many years. I have some artists who have been there since we opened the building.
Wow. So 14 plus years now. That's amazing. Stephanie, when did you and your colleagues in the city, in the planning department, start seeing, wow, there's starting to be some other pressures, some external interest in this region and more people coming in a way, not that you hadn't planned for? You said you and your colleagues always saw the potential. When did it start to be, wow, there's a real turn of the dial here in terms of interest in the RAD from a development standpoint?
There's a couple different key moments that I'm thinking about. One of them is probably in 2016 or 2017. So it was after the city had purchased 91 Riverside Drive and was considering redeveloping it and partner with a bunch of institutions, including what is now Arts AVL, to look at developing affordable live workspaces for artists. We had a survey done asking people what they needed as far as space. And this survey was specifically done for artists. And it was really illuminating. It was really helpful for us to see that people still, as many artists that there were in the district, and it's never gone down, by the way, the number of artists has always increased up until this point, that more people still wanted to be there. People wanted to live there. They still wanted spaces to make their art, just like they did when they first started coming. People certainly weren't contacting us about affordable gallery space or anything like that. So that moment was important note or signal for us. And then I'd say the other thing is, as much as our work with the city started as a response to the local public sector saying we need some investment, the investment that we put in, which generally was completed, the whole thing was mostly completed right during the pandemic. It was great for it to have opened during that time. People needed all the open space. It attracted developers, 100%. And this is a good point that Gail made earlier. If you're on the east side of the railroad tracks, which these two women both are, you're not as concerned with the flood area and how that may impact you. The properties that are on the west side of the railroad tracks, those are the ones I talked about being potentially contaminated. They are right outside of the floodway and very much in the floodplain. They're backed right up to the railroad tracks and have that as a constraint. It's very hard to develop there. But the city knew that if we put in a lot of open space and infrastructure, we were going to make it more attractive to people. So we also instituted a form-based code that told people this is the type of investment. If you're going to invest here, this is the kind of new building that we want to see. And it took a long time, but right around that 2020, 2021 mark is when we started seeing people come from Atlanta and Charlotte and other places, and usually partner with a local partner for some of their development, but say, we want to be here too.
You just said something that I thought was really interesting, that the development of Riverside Drive and making that a very pedestrian and bike-friendly route, that attracted developers. I hadn't necessarily thought of that because this city attracts developers. We have so many hoteliers who come in. There are lots of new residential complexes going in, not necessarily just in Asheville, but going up on that road between Asheville and Weaverville. There's some development there and elsewhere. But it took those kinds of infrastructure improvements in the River Arch District to lure these developments. And you said you knew, you and your colleagues knew that would happen, and that you tried to help shape the kinds of...
That's right.
Can you kind of bullet point things you and your colleagues in city planning wanted to see happen and didn't want to see happen? What has your department been on top of in terms of RAD development to try to help steer?
Again, we can go back to the flooding and environmental sensitivity and paying attention to the first word of River Arts District, which is river. Mm-hmm. One of the things that the community wanted to see and the city agreed with is to try to do environmentally sensitive kinds of development. So that means building up out of the flood hazard areas. So the type of form-based code that we developed for everything that's on the west side of those railroad tracks, it doesn't allow you to have really habitable spaces on that ground level. That's all for parking. And that's another kind of, let's be compact and let's use our land in a really smart way. If we can't build there because it's going to flood, we'll use that area for parking. But also let's try to know that we should minimize parking and promote bicycle parking in the area, which both of those are done in the form-based code. Because we have this, the area's first protected bike lane. We have the spine of a growing greenway network where people should be able to get around. You're less than a mile from downtown Asheville. So that's, just an example of some of the things that we wanted to see. We provide bonuses for people if they do affordable housing. They get to create bigger buildings if they do that.
How many developers, and I've bullet pointed for myself a rundown from the small 26-unit development, the RAD View, from the Wire, 237 units, and the Stone Yard, 263 units that have been approved. And then I don't know what the development at 179 Riverside's called. Is there a name behind that? It's by BR.
It's just changed. So I think now it's called the Residence.
Okay, there's 240 there. That's more than 700 to 800 residents coming in. I've seen some parking structures in some of that are being built, but how can this area where, yes, we have a Riverside Drive, but we don't have road widening, we don't have other new roads. Are you looking at this, Stephanie, and going, okay, we can't accommodate cars for all these residents, or what do you say to that?
So I mentioned that the city doesn't like to promote additional parking. It's not the greatest land use for anywhere in the city, frankly. However, it is important. That's how most people get around all of the residential developments are providing probably more parking than they need to. So if you think about the Wire that's on the old Dave Steele site, they're going to have extra public parking spaces. You mentioned the Stone Yard, which is being done by the same development team. They're very likely, once they build, going to have more parking spaces that are for the public. We thought about this really hard before we did all those infrastructure investments. I am not concerned with whether or not there's enough parking in the district. From the standpoint of people who might be driving around saying, I want to park right next to this specific business, or if they need to deliver something, that is different. I am concerned with loading zones for artists. I'm not necessarily concerned with people who, we have a trolley now. We have this great Arts ABL trolley that's going down between downtown, the River Arts, and they're probably going to expand to Biltmore Village. We do have 2 buses in our transit system that go on the north and south edges of those districts. We have all of these ways to get around on bicycles and walking. So this is probably the best area for people to be making investments where we're not concentrating on cars.
Parking's part of it, but part of it is the traffic itself.
But residential uses don't create the kind of road traffic that you're thinking of.
They don't.
Commercial uses create. So you just think about if we stuck a McDonald's down there, I shouldn't be using a specific name, it would just be cars in and out all day, people lining up to go through a drive-through. How many times do you leave your home every day? Probably once, twice, sometimes never. So that when you think about the amount of trips that are generated, even if there are 600 new residential units that are in the district, many of those folks hopefully are going to go walk to get their coffee now. They're not going to go drive to get their coffee.
True.
So the amount of traffic that it generates is usually, it's amazing to people when you see it. It really does get absorbed by many of our areas. So I'm more concerned long term with there are projects, and we're going to have to manage this as a community. There are projects coming up like the I-26 project.
Yeah.
That construction is going to mean that there'll be traffic rerouted through West Asheville and the River Arts District and other places. Anyone who has driven on I-26 going south for the last 3 years knows that if you're a local, you know how to get around, and the same thing's going to happen here. So I want to support our local folks to be able to manage those one-time problems.
I'm just foreseeing now from Riverside going up to Klingman just being a gridlock. Is that what you're seeing like that?
If it's a gridlock, people will avoid it and they'll use other ways to get around, right? People are smart.
Resourceful.
They are really resourceful.
And keep in mind that the people who live in the River Arts District aren't all going to go out at the same time or in the same direction. Some will head towards the south and go to AB Tech or the hospital, or some will head downtown, some will go north.
Pop up to the grocery store. Yeah. It's pretty dispersed. The residential uses are a great thing for this district, I'll say.
And I agree 100%.
Great.
Too. Yeah.
Fully in favor of all the residential development that's going on there. For one thing, the RAD has become, to a large extent, almost solely a tourist destination.
Right.
And that's not sustainable. So that in slow tourist months, things really die down and the neighborhood doesn't seem as lively, as safe, as many eyes on the street. Whereas if we have people actually living there, we're going to have people that walk to these restaurants and walk to the galleries and walk to the studios.
And take the classes.
And take a class.
Right.
And that actually live in the neighborhood. And I think that is what's so sustainable.
Remember, this is just the first in a 2-part conversation with Gail McCarthy, Hedy Fischer, and Stephanie Monson Dahl. The second part will post Thursday, June 20th. Our conversation happened at the BB Theater in downtown Asheville, which comes to me courtesy of the Asheville Contemporary Dance Theater and Susan and Giles Collard. If you value the Overlook's place in Asheville's media landscape, please consider joining dozens of others who are supporting the show through my Patreon crowdfunding page. Become a member for as little as $5 a month. Visit patreon.com/theoverlookpodcast. Our First Look newsletter gives you just a handful of daily headlines from around the local media landscape to get you on your morning. We also have a weekly newsletter devoted to all things The Overlook that hits you every Friday. Both are free and available at podavl.com/newsletter. The theme song for The Overlook, Maker's Song, comes to us courtesy of the Asheville duo The Resonant Rogues. The Overlook is a production of Podcast Asheville. New episodes come out every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us on any social media channel at AVL Overlook. And I'll see you on the next episode of The Overlook with Matt Peiken.